All of these served as slaves and lived in huts provided by their masters for many years after the emancipation. They learned and depended on their masters, yet there was a yearning for better things for themselves. Some of the ex-slaves thought freedom meant free from work. Others knew the real meaning, yet without money and homes. They hadn't been trained to think for themselves. Life must have been hard. The Reconstruction period was hard for both groups. The whites had lost brothers and friends in the combat. Now he was being denied free labor. That was a financial loss to him. We can see why. The landholders had resentment. The slaves were childish, no money. All they knew was hard labor. Men had been cruelly treated, yet there were some landholders that were kind to the ex-slaves, giving them food and a place to lodge. They learned from their masters, and there was a yearning for a better conditions. I think you can see why. They wanted homes. They wanted to be able to read. Land could be purchased for $10 per acre. A few of the ex-slaves were thrifty enough to save their earnings. They bought land and built homes. Some of the first to purchase land were Ben Tyree, Anthony Branham, and Jerry Parrish. Parrish bought a large parcel of land 2.5 miles southeast of Castellan Springs. Others followed him. When a man decided to build his house, his neighbors would come. They would cut down trees, clear the piece of land. The logs had to lay a while to season before being used. I think Mr. Bates told you in his discussion how those log houses were built. The houses were made of logs, usually one large room, 20 to 25 feet square, and often a shed and an upstairs called a loft. Usually 4 or more beds were in each house. Most of the families were large, often 10 to 12 children. The windows were without glass, just like doors, usually 3 to 4 feet from the floor by the chimney corner. Glass wasn't used. The fireplaces was usually 3 to 4 feet long and about 2 feet wide. See, on these fireplaces, they did all their cooking. And across the fireplace, maybe you've seen, there was an iron piece across there, and the pots hung on those fireplaces. The food was cooked very slowly. And on the hearth is where they did their bacon. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen the Dutch oven. I think most of you have seen it. Something like a skillet with about 2 inches from the where you place embers underneath this oven, and then you place embers on the top. And then there was a Dutch oven in a cone shape. My auntie had one. It was made of metal. And you put it in front of the hearth, and it got very hot. And you could place the food in there and cook it very slowly. Later on, they had step stoves. And that step stove, the top caps were about 9 inches higher than the lower caps. That's why they called it a step stove. Their furniture was crude. Many of their chairs were stools, and they were made with bale kegs. And then they had the trunnel bed. That was very important. It was about the size of a twin bed, and not quite that wide. It was, there were no slats used, but they had cords with this trunnel bed, and it was about 2 inches from the floor and very short. If you remember, I've seen those old-fashioned beds, they were all very high. And this trunnel bed in the day was pushed under the big bed, and at night it was pulled out. And it might interest you to know that most of the farms had geese, ducks, turkeys, and chickens. And at intervals, the geese were caught, and they were picked for their feathers. And that was the pride of every young woman, to have a goose feather bed and goose pillows. And they took care not to pick their wings or tail feathers when they were picking. Some used ducks, but the goose feathers were the prize. Then many of the families used straw from wheat when the wheat had been threshed and placed in ticks for mattresses. The straw was gotten in the summer after harvesting the wheat. It served as a nice mattress. It was soft and pliable. In the winter, you slept on the feather tick, and the straw tick was at the bottom. In the summer, you reversed it. You put the straw tick on top to be cool, and the feather tick was at the bottom. The slaves were unaccustomed to managing. Often $150 was the total amount of money that they had to clothe, feed, and supply the family. Yet they knew how to plant and grow vegetables of all kinds. They knew wild vegetables such as watercress, poke, wild mustard, and creasy. They learned the art of drying vegetables such as peas, beans, pumpkins, apples, and peaches. These they would prepare and place on the roof of the house for 3 or 4 days to dry, being careful to remove them each afternoon. And after 4 or 5 days they had been dried, they would be placed in sacks, flour sacks, with a little lime for detergents to keep the bugs away. And they with their vegetables as turnips and cabbage, they were placed in hills. I suppose a hill would be about 36 inches in diameter, and you would turn the cabbage down and cover it over with dirt. It would bleach during the winter. See, we didn't have refrigeration where you could get fresh vegetables. And those cabbage were placed in hills, also turnips. In the springs, those turnips could be pulled out and set, and they would bear greens. Then they had their meat was often squirrels, young rabbits, groundhogs, opossums. They were sources of meat. Sugar cane was grown, and that supplied them. There was the molasses, and that supply was rich in iron. The molasses played a vital part in the family's diet. It was considered a staple. This molasses was served as a dessert for breakfast. It was stored in barrels and jugs. They used it in making pies, cookies, gingerbread, and other foods. No less than 10 gallons were supposed to be used for a family. Just like we store our flour or sugar, you were supposed to have your molasses. Nature was kind. It provided for most of their needs. In the spring, they made use of wild greens. In the fall, pumpkins, wild grapes, hickory-nuts, chestnuts, walnuts, pawpaws. Pawpaw is a plant, looks like a banana. It may grow about 4 inches tall, or it may be taller. And then they used wild grapes and persimmons for wine. The women were very industrious. They learned to use the spinning wheel. They knew how to cart wool, knit socks and caps. They also knew certain plants for dye, as the pokeberry, elderberries, and green walnuts. Those walnuts were gathered green, and the hulls were steeped. I don't know if any of you have ever gathered walnuts, but just hulling a walnut, you can get that same. And when they boiled that, they had a dye that would be very good. It's said that necessity is the mother of invention. Making quilts was a necessity. Often they would help each other in quilting. Many of their white mistresses would do sewing for them in exchange for free labor. And then they made their soap. We didn't have washing powders and those things, and there were plenty of ashes. Those ashes were collected and placed in something like a hopper in this, maybe 3 or 4 barrels full. They were kept covered, and in the spring you would pour water over those ashes, and a substance would run out, black substance. They called it lye, and you would mix that with soap grease, old soap, old bones, and cook that for maybe 2 or 3 hours. And you had a substance about the consistency, I presume, of Vaseline. And it had a odor, a very clean odor, something like pine sol. That was their soap for laundering. And most of their clothes were handmade. They didn't have machines. Darning and mending, that was essential after laundry. One can imagine the scarcity of doctors and the need for medical care in those days. They resorted to home remedies and the use of herbs for sickness. The women would aid each other in sickness, and a woman known now as a midwife, they was called a granny. And all of the babies, of course, were delivered in their homes. In an OB case, the mother was made to stay in bed 3 or 4 weeks, and there were many superstitions as what she could do and what she couldn't. They substituted many things for a powder. They used flour. brown this flour in a pan, and it becomes very silky if you don't scorch it. Then they didn't have mentholatum, but they used the fat of sheep called mutton tallow. This fat was dried, was cooked down, but wasn't any seasoning in it. And you use that to rub around your neck, and as we would use mentholatum. They called that mutton tallow. And they also used it around their chest. And for there was asafoetida. I intended to have gotten a cake from the store. That was used, I don't know what asafoetida is, but it comes in a small cake about the size of a quarter. You get it at the store. Each child was supposed to wear that around their neck to ward off disease, placed in a little sack. It has a very pungent odor, and you can't sit close to people with it. And then they carried a red onion in their pocket. That was supposed to ward off diseases. There was superstition among them, and you can imagine why. Cough syrups were made by steeping hickory bark, cherry bark, mullein, horehound. Then they would add whiskey or honey to it. That was the cough syrup. And coal oil was an indispensable medicine. They used it for wounds or for boils. And then if you had a cold and it was very stubborn, you would take a teaspoon of sugar and sprinkle coal oil on it and eat that. That was supposed to loosen the cold. Their homes continued to be built near Parish's settlement, and there was, until they later called it Hickory Grove. It's assumed the name was because of the large groves of hickory nuts. Some of the hickory nuts were as large as a 50-cent piece, but the hickory trees are dying out there now. That was called a scaly bark. Within 20 years after emancipation, more than 20 blacks in this settlement owned farms. Their tools were crude, of course. With gratitude and love in their hearts, these settlers felt the need for a place of worship. I'm told during slavery they would often meet in their homes and they would sing songs, being careful to place a large black kettle in front of the door so the sound wouldn't escape. That was their means of worship. After the colored people had settled and gained their freedom, as I've said before, they were anxious about worshiping God. At first they would meet in their homes in the winter, and in the summer they would meet under shaded groves. Usually there'd be someone in the meeting with a little more leadership ability than the others, and they would make talks and conduct meetings. There was one man named Anthony Branham, I mentioned him previously, who owned a small parcel of land, and he willingly consented for the people to build a church on 1/2 acre. The people of the community were of different faiths and beliefs about the way of service should be done. They believed according to their masters, of course. Dick Ramsey and Anthony Branham wanted to be in the Carmelite church. Paul Bentley and Dick Ramsey and Henry Urey believed in the Presbyterian church. Mr. Bay, do you remember Henry Urey? That was before your time. He was of the Presbyterian faith, and he was very emotional. He wasn't able to read, but he was a nice fella. And my brothers were home this weekend, and I guess we were sinful as children. We used to mark him in his prayers. He wasn't able to read, but he felt he was called to preach. And there was the white lady on Hartsville Pike, Mrs. Johns. Her granddaughter her niece works at Penny's. And he would go there on Saturday afternoons, and she would read the Bible to him and relate a sermon. And then Uncle Henry would go in Trousdale County on Sunday and attempt to preach that. His sermons were filled with emotion, and we would laugh at the expressions. He would pray and said, "Lord, cut down the hills and mountains, make the crooked paths straight, and fill up the valleys." We would laugh so much about his sermons, but he was very sincere, I'm sure. Joe Bell and Tom Harper believed in the Methodist Church, and Mark Bate, Ned Rankins, and Phil Wilkes wanted to be in the Baptist Church. They had their different beliefs. The men cut down the trees and hew them into logs. They all worked arduously for the erection of the first little church. The Carmelites had their service on the first Sunday, the Presbyterians' faith on the second Sunday in each month. Those of the Baptist faith held their service on the third Sunday, and the fourth Sunday was reserved for the Methodists. Each denomination was friendly to the others, and on Sunday the little church would be full of earnest worshipers. It soon became apparent that a larger building was needed for service, and so they decided to erect a larger building. Now this is the picture of that other building that they erected, and they also served that served as the schoolhouse. A two-story building was built which could be used for the church as well as the school. The Presbyterians and the Carmelites faded out past, and as you know, Sumner County is predominantly Baptist for the blacks, and the Methodists moved to a new location that was given to them by Tyree, and it later became known as Bell's Chapel. It grew and played an important role in the community. Each fourth Sunday was observed as homecoming. At present, I think there's only one survivor of the Methodist Church. The Baptists continued to worship there, and about 1903 they became restless and they wanted to move. And they bought land on the Hartsville Pike, 2 acres for $70. I don't know whether you know where the lane you call Crenshaw's Lane is. Well, the church is on there. The land was sold to the blacks for $70, and the building of a new church was an arduous task. But with faith and determination in the fall of 1903, the work was begun. Many of the members gave logs. A log would yield 250 feet of lumber if it was very large. The church ledger reveals that many white friends gave logs and other assistance, namely Mr. Ed Payne, Malone Sweeney, Dr. Humphrey Bate, Mr. Brazier. Mr. Brazier is the father of, he used to run the post office at Cascade Springs, Ed Wilkes and Mrs. Mamie Glenn. The logs were hauled to Coram's Mill and sawed into lumber. The church was completed and ready for occupancy in 1905. In 1906, the Baptist Church entertained the East Fork Association, which had representatives from 30 or more churches. The unit I think I have finished with the churches now. I want to talk about Mr. Finnick. In 1868, Mr. William Finnick came to this community. He was from South Carolina, and he was of the Baptist faith, and he did much to encourage the Baptists. That picture is also, if you notice, Mr. Finnick is on that picture, and I have his picture somewhere else.
Why don't you tell them which one of those is your father?
I don't have it yet. I'll show it a little later on. This is the picture of Mr. Finnick. He came in 1868 as an ex-slave from South Carolina, and here I have the picture of Peter Tyree, one of his students. One thought I'm trying to get over, I didn't mention it, was the effect of a dedicated teacher. I heard Mr. Riggs said he would rather for a teacher to be dedicated than being so smart. But I'm going to try to show that with Mr. Finnick's seriousness, he did what he could for the young people. Then he urged them to go to Nashville to college. And after they attended college in Nashville, they came back to Sumner County, and 90% of them taught in Sumner County. And I think it was due to Mr. Finnick's guidance. Mr. Finnick enrolled a large number of children to the extent he had to have an assistant. It was an uncommon thing for children to walk 4.5 miles to school. That was our people from Macedonia, 4 and 5 miles. You came early and you brought your food in a little tin box and you stayed till near night. There was a large picnic held on the first Saturday in August each year, known as Finnick's Picnic in the woods. School children and many of their parents met at school. They paraded to the picnic, following by a band. For a period of 2 or more hours, a program was presented of songs, speeches, and drills. This event drew hundreds of people. Many came Friday evening and early Saturday morning. They came in wagons and they came horseback. It served to inspire and stimulate the community and the adjacent communities. There were times when Senator Bates and other white dignitaries would visit the picnic and make short talks and words of encouragement. Just the fact that the senator was all the ground, that was all that was needed. Mr. Phoenix not only did his teaching during the day, but he lived in the community. He visited the homes of the parents. He saw the need of counseling and gave direction to many families. He was able to inspire his children through guidance, and a large number of the children went to Nashville to school. After the boys had completed certain grades under Mr. Finnick and the girls, some did maid work, some farm work, some laundry, and nurses, and a score more of his advanced students went to Roger Williams. You will hear more about Roger Williams. I want to read to you something about Roger Williams. It's not in Sumner County, but it had such an important effect on these people of Sumner County. When you were young, if you didn't go to Roger Williams, you just weren't in it among the Baptists. These are some pictures of Roger Williams. They're old, but you can see something. I'll tell you something more about Roger Williams. I'll first mention the girls' dormitory. Roger Williams was begun in 1863 by the American Baptist Home Missionary Society up north. They came down and organized, they got a grant, and they organized Roger Williams University. And in 1865, it was open, and some began attending school there. The girls' dormitory housed the women teachers and a space for 150 young women. There was a basement which provided dining space and laundry. The college or the boarding department could care for 300 students. Each student was required to sign a pledge. See, this was a Baptist school. Desiring to become a member of Roger Williams University, I hereby pledge myself to obey all regulations, to abstain from all uses of tobacco and intoxicating drinks, to devote myself earnestly to my studies as may be assigned. The daily sessions of the university included a service of singing, reading the Bible, and prayer. All students without exception were required to attend these services. Regular prayer meetings were held by the whole school on Tuesday night and by the young women on Friday night. Sunday school was conducted each Sunday at 9 to 10:15 by a faculty member. There were missionary societies, YW and YMCA, Glee Club, College Club, and debating team. The library consisted of over 600 volumes. This was the dress. Every young woman needed 1 or 2 flannel dresses, not more than 4 wash dresses, 2 or 3 colored flannel skirts, 3 or 4 white skirts, 2 large kitchen aprons, besides school aprons, warm, substantial underclothing, a good wrap, good rubbers, and overshoes. Each young woman was supposed to have a box with needles, thimbles, scissors, thread, darning, cotton, to prevent rivalry and discourage extravagance in buying gaudy and dressy clothes. They had uniforms. All the girls had uniforms. No silk or satin skirts, ribbons or sashes were allowed. The young men were allowed to visit or call on the young ladies 1 hour twice per month. The school year consisted of 32 weeks. The first term, 12 weeks, the second term, 10 weeks, and the third, 10 weeks. A number of the young men worked in the families living in the vicinity. Some did jobs at the university building, for which they received $2 to $5 per month. Board was $2.25 a week. Tuition was $1 a month. I'm mentioning this because I can almost tell now people who attended Roger Williams are either their children. It's something it did to you. I don't know. But will read to you later several that have been to Roger. And they just felt it was an honor to go there. If they didn't stay a whole year, some ministers would go there. They would work until December and put in a winter quarter. My father was very humorous, and he said sometime in the meeting someone would raise his hand and say, "I gone to Roger Williams. I rubbed my head against the college wall. It was just an honor to have been at Roger." Scholarship. The state of Tennessee established for children in Tennessee of African descent 66 scholarships of $50 each. These were granted by the state senate to persons of competitive examination. The state board designed Roger Williams as one school eligible to receive those scholarships. It amounted to $6.25 per month. About 15 students would qualify. Those studying for the ministry were required to take biblical geography, map drawing, Old Testament history, the facts and teaching of creation, life of David, foundation of new Christianity, preparation and delivering of service. The Baptists appreciated Roger Williams, and if you were just anybody in Sumner County and you were aspiring for anything, you were supposed to go to Roger, even though you didn't attend but many quarters. Along in the 20s, Roger Williams fell into financial problems. I think you can understand, and the Home Missionary Society withdrew some of its support, and the Baptist Convention attempted to help Roger, but it fell into financial problems. I can remember as a child, previous to Thanksgiving, one Thanksgiving, on Monday or Tuesday, the boys killed rabbits and the ladies sent chickens and canned vegetables and blackberries. We were trying to supply the dinner for Roger Williams, but that did nothing during the Depression to take care of them. Roger Williams continued to struggle, and in 1936, Mr. Samuel Owen was the president of the Baptist State Convention, and it continued to have problems. And later on, Roger Williams, they moved it to Memphis. They felt it would be better to be in Memphis because State College was in operation in Nashville, and a church school couldn't compete against our state school. And I continued to have problems, but we were trying to help it. And I think in the 60s, many of you have heard of Lemoyne College in Memphis. They bought land there, and Roger Williams, the old Roger Williams, it was called Owen College then. It merged with Lemoyne, and now it's Lemoyne Owen College. Our church is still supported. It's in Memphis now, and it's supposed to be an accredited college, and it's a 4-year school. They also taught at Roger Greek, history of civilization, Latin, Cicero and Virgil. I've got my papers mixed up here. I didn't mention Dr. Nathan Bishop and his wife of New York were benefactors, and Dr. Phillips was the president of Roger for many years. As I mentioned before, Mr. Finnick encouraged his children to go to Nashville. Now, many that couldn't go to school, but they were ambitious, they went to Indianapolis, so much so that it's been called the Black Heaven for the people at Castellan Springs. There's a church in Indianapolis known as Mount Parian, and I'm sure 90% of its members have their roots from Castellan Springs. Now, I'm going to mention to you some of the students that went to Nashville. They were Mr. Finnick students. This is one, Peter B. Tyree. I think I mentioned before that his father was one of the landowners. Peter was an outstanding minister and a builder. He was the son of Martha and Henry Tyree, and they were anxious for their son to secure an education. Peter's father lacked education but was interested in the Negro youth of the community. The Finnick picnic was held on his land. He later gave land for the new Rosenwald School, also gave land for the new Methodist church that was built. Peter was a zealous teacher. He taught at Parker's Chapel for 20 or more years. He was also a minister. I have noticed in the community where those Finnick students taught, there was just something you could almost trace. Now, this is a young man from Portland, Alfonso Smith. Maybe some of you know the Smiths at Portland. There were 3 boys there, Harold, Robert, and Barry. Barry is in his 60s, and he's yet trying to go to school. He has had problems, but he's trying to complete something. Harold passed about 2 years ago, and Robert also passed. Robert had 5 boys, and they were very, very smart boys. This young man did his high school work in Union. He finished State College, and then he has his master's degree, and he's the only black boy in the county that I know of has his Ph.D., and now he's gone in the field of medicine. They were very, very, but I give Mr. Kratari something. It seemed that those children that went to Roger, they were able to inspire or do something, I don't know what, but they had an effect on their children. Then I'm mentioning Henry Tolliver. He was a Mr. Finnick student. He was the son of Laura and Wash Tolliver, born in the Hickory Grove community, and a student of Mr. Finnick. He was born of poor ex-slave parents, but with will and determination, he attended Roger Williams, and he graduated in 1905. He was the second student in the county to be graduated from college. That's the picture of Henry Tolliver. He was an ardent worker, very dedicated, and he was also a minister. Then I have Charles Brimage Bate. He was born on the Bate farm, and this was his father, Mark Bate. And I never knew him, but I admire him for certain qualities. He stayed on the farm when the Bate men were in service, and I think of him as being very honest and dependable. I was told once he was buying land for his children, and he was short of money, and General Bate told him to go ahead and buy more. But he was afraid to. He says, I'm afraid I won't pay for it. And some of us would have taken the chance of General paying for it, but he wouldn't go any farther than he knew he could pay. He wasn't able to read and write, but at one time he said he was working hard for his grandchildren, and he's buried on the Bate farm. I want to feel that he absorbed much from the Bates. Charles attended Roger Williams University, but before going to Roger, he used to teach at Kansas. In those days, if you were large, had a nice physique, and could express yourself well, I'm thinking many in the 7th and 8th grade became teachers. Charles taught in the Kansas community for a number of years. He built the first Roosevelt School in the county for the Negroes. I think it was in the 20s, and he taught under Mr. Hunter, and he and Mr. Hunter were very good friends. In 1922, they had the uniform registers. Prior to then, our registers were very small and long, and you didn't put so much information in them as you do now. I'm not so sure whether Mr. Hunter was careless or what, but anyway, near the close of school, he gave Charles this new register to fill out. And if you know any of you have taught, you know you can't fill those registers out if you haven't started with them in September. Well, Charles looked at this, and he came home. He went back to Mr. Hunt and said, I'll just give you the last month. I can't fill it. It's too much. And Mr. Hunter had a drawl. No, Charles, you're too poor to do that. You go back and fill that. Well, I was in high school at the time. I could think better and maybe figure better than I can now. So we worked on that register for about 2 weeks. We had to make the 5-month report. We made names, we made age and children, but we made a tally. carried this register to Mr. Hunter. We've laughed about it so much, and then you had to swear to the accuracy of your register, see. You do now? Well, he carried this register to Mr. Hunter, and he said, "Charlie, do you swear to this?" And he said, "No, sir. Nobody else got good sense would swear." He gave him the check and came on home. But you couldn't. But if those registers, unless you start with them, but he had nothing on the background to do that. Then he went to Union High and taught there for about 20 years. He taught algebra there, and he always taught. He felt that if you could get a boy to reason, that was essential. And he enjoyed quoting expressions from Cicero and Caesar. One of his favorite expressions was, "God pity them one and pity them all, of all the sad words of tongue or pen. The saddest of these it might have been." He taught for 53 years. And after he retired, he said during his 53 years he had lost about 5 days for illness. He was very healthy. And after retiring, the next year they asked him, the superintendent asked him to teach again, and he just thought that was such an honor to be called back. But he said no, he wanted to make way for the younger people. I think he was very devoted, because there were times there were so many problems in the family, trying to rear 3 children with small salaries, and with one boy at the medical school and one boy in college, problems were many, and I have known him to pray at night when problems were pressing, and he'll say, "I must go see John in the morning." That was John Swaney. They grew up together. And when he'd go in the bank, Mr. Swaney would look at his countenance and realize something was wrong, and he'd usually say, "What can I do for you, Charlie?" And he never turned him down. There were times there were 2 and 3 notes in the bank, and my younger brother just thought Mr. Swaney owned the bank. He didn't know that he was a note teller in the bank. He worked in church for a number of years, and he passed in 1957. He too was one of Mr. Finnick's students, and went to Roger. He was the first graduate in the county from college. He graduated in 1900 from Roger Williams. That's his picture there. And then I'm discussing another one of Mr. Finnick's students. This was Nora Turner. She was born in Trousdale County. Her mother died when she was 5 years of age with childbirth. And she lived with different sisters and brothers. And she said at 5 years of age she entered school. She had a brother-in-law that was very kind to her. And she came to Sumner County and went to Mr. Finnick's school. And at 17 years old, she taught her first school in Trousdale County. I think she said she had 51 pupils. And she taught in many communities in the county. And in 1914, there was a uniform examination for the state. Prior to then, different counties would have their examination, but all undergraduates had to take that uniform examination. There were 2 colored blacks that were college students, Mr. Tolliver and Charles Bate. They didn't have to take it, but others. And she was the only black that passed that examination. And Charles Bate almost wore the thing out, showing it to people. He was so elated that she passed that examination. She taught in many rural schools and took an examination, and she taught in high school. She hadn't done but 2 years of college, but she was certified by taking an examination. She finished her normal course at Roger in 1900. That was equivalent to our sophomore work now. And while she was there, she signed a pledge. It was in a temperance meeting, never to use profanity or vain words. And that pledge she kept. I have aspired for it, but I failed on some occasion. she was married in 1900. Now, I remember in 1920 there was a school at night in her home. She would teach the boys. They would come in the winter. Many of the boys, the black boys, they weren't able to read, and they couldn't sign checks as they wanted to. And she spent much time teaching with those boys. And she said she never met but 2 children she couldn't teach to read. She said if you gave them the right material, you were able, but most people gave the children the material that was too hard to read. And she said she enjoyed teaching children that were retarded, those that were slow. There were times when I have an examination here that I'd like for some of you to see. Maybe some of you were victims years ago when the superintendent sent the examinations to the county, the 8th grade. I have one here that was Mr. Wilson's back in 1927. They sent it around. But there were times that most of the times the superintendents made those examinations for the children. And my mother used to assist Mr. Hunter in making those examinations, but she had better sense than to divulge the secret that she was helping him. She liked to work with retarded children, and the Wright children lived nearby, Archer Wright's family, and they used to come there, and she used to help them. And she also taught Julia Tyree. Julia Tyree was born in a wealthy family, and she was young, and Daddy didn't want it. Only child, he wasn't anxious for her to begin school alone. So she taught Julia until Julia was ready for the 4th grade, and she took a great deal of pride in teaching Julia Tyree. And she taught Latin and English for her last 25 years at Union High. I remember as she grew older, the children would come in from, during the summer at the fair, they would bring her gifts, flowers, and boxes of candy, and I've never been able to receive those things. I think some of them are still angry with me for what I did when I was in school. But she received many gifts, and the members of her family all had a degree, and she didn't. In 1924, she began going back to school. She went to State College. And from 1924 until 1943, not every summer, but it was 1943 when she got her B.S. degree from State College. And she was an honest student, and she was very happy to get this. After she retired, she enjoyed writing poems and poetry for her friends. She wrote a compilation of poems known as the Nuggets of Gold. And she was a recipient of many little gifts from her children that she taught. This is her picture as a school teacher during Mr. Vertrese's lifetime.
She was your mom. You didn't tell us.
No.
She talked about her father, and she didn't tell us.
Now, this is the picture of Emma Bates. She was Mark Bates' daughter. She was born during slavery, and I think she was given to Miss Maisie prior to the emancipation. And she loved Miss Maisie, so Miss Maisie Bates. Am I right? Her last name. That when Emma married, she named her child after Miss Maisie, and that was a very close association. And I have a little certificate here that I found in the lockbox. She received in 1880. I wonder where did I do with it. This is it. That was her certificate she received for Elizabeth. She must have been around 17 or 18 years of age. She was very comical, and I've often thought about her, and she gave me a great deal of inspiration. She was the mother of 4 children, and between 1914, 1913, and 1915, her 3 children had passed, and she moved to our home, on our place, built her home. But I think much of our training came from her. She was very very comical, and yet she was an ardent church worker and a very devout person. She said on one occasion she was so worried, she went out and prayed in the woods, and she said, Lord, if you remove this burden, I'll be more dedicated as a Christian. And I think she was. I think she said she always liked to forgive. It was so easy for her to forgive people. It made her seem close to God when she could forgive. She used to tell me many comical things about things. She said the white boys used to have lots of fun frightening the Negroes. They could put a sheet over them and just run them so far they would think they were some of their masters that were coming back from the grave, and she used to laugh about funny things that happened to them. I remember her husband passed, and she lived 40 years to the day after he passed. And she was a very modest widow, I guess you would say, and someone asked her, Miss Emma, are you going to marry? She married a man named Jack. She said Jack was a good man, but if I have to live with another Negro man, I won't get to heaven. So she decided not to. She decided not to marry again. In her latter life, she did served as a nurse in OB cases. You know, people delivered their babies in their homes. I've been asking Mrs. Hibbett. I remember she used to go to the Hibbett home, and the Barrys and the Chenals. Some of you may remember Mr. Dave Barry was killed. Well, she nursed there, and I can remember. And I used to be with her, and she would keep her basket packed when she knew it was near time. And I've been awakened many a night. The men would come there. A man would ride a horse and then bring a horse saddle, and they would awaken us, and she would go on ride the horse that he had brought. And she had her things in a flat basket. I can remember it so well. And sometimes she would leave me at 2 o'clock in the morning or 3, but I would stay there until day. And she had a large washpan. She'd always carry her washpan wherever she went to work. That was part of her talk. In her latter years, she stayed at, I think her last work was in Mr. William Bates' home. She went there about 6 weeks before Julie Tyree was born. And she worked in and out of the place until Julie was in her 20s. And she loved Julia dearly. Her children were dead, and I suppose she felt very close to Julia. She told me once that Julia broke something, I don't know what it was, of value, and Mr. William grabbed Julia to whip her, to punish her. My auntie was real large, and she went up to him and took Julia out of his arms, said, you're not going to whip this child. She does deserve punishment. And of course, he could have prevented it, but he said if she thought that much of the child, he wouldn't oppose it. And, big part. Yes, ma'am. And Mr. Bates said that sometimes he felt much of her. I said Julie Tyree because I've known her ever since she's a baby, and that's what she is to me. He felt that much of her training, moral training, were ideas that she had gotten from Aunt Emma. They were very close together. This is a certificate that Charles Bates received from when he was allowed to teach a high school. Now, I think on that certificate it says he was eligible to teach all high school. He was qualified, but he had the papers for it, but we know he wasn't qualified of teaching all of those subjects. This is the picture of the school that Charles taught at Kansas before he went to high school. Now the people of the Hickory Grove community have need to be proud of the progress they have made, and they can look back on some of their fine citizens. Also, with the schools and churches, they were not lacking in honest to goodness labor, as many of the people grew to be good farmers, namely Millard Branham, Henry Tyree, Vale Urey, Wash Tolliver, and others. There was a Mrs. Nanny Porter, a retired teacher who lived in Davidson County, and she was the granddaughter of Walter Parrish. Walter Tyree, who had property in Oklahoma, was Ben Tyree's grandson, and I think I showed you Pete Tyree's picture there. Then there was a George Branham, grandson of Anthony Branham, who worked in Detroit, and he sang with the Four Dixies. And Uncle Mark's children and his grandchildren, they have striven to make a contribution in society. 3 of his grandchildren have become medical doctors, and they were teachers. And I think one thing they've prided themselves on is being honest and dependable. And there has remained, and there yet remains, a love between these children of Uncle Mark, his grandchildren. This past week, 2 of them came in one from Oklahoma and one from Tulsa, from Texas, and they brought some pecan trees to set out. And one of their idea was, we want to take one to General Bates' home and plant it on the Bate farm. There's still that love. And Mark Bate is buried on the farm there. There's still that love there. It's to be remembered that Macedonia, as some of you know, it was once a part of Hickory Grove, and the people attended school there. But in the process of time, they felt they were walking too far, so they decided to build them a school and a church there. And the land was given by George Drake. Some of you may know Herman Drake. He lives in the county. He lives there. And from Macedonia, we received many teachers, Haynes, Daly, and there was a Frances Bullock and her daughter Alice. They became teachers, and they were also from the old Hickory Grove School. I think I'd be safe to say that from the Hickory Grove School, Mr. Phoenix teachers, pupils, maybe 20 or more became teachers in the county, more than from any other community in the county. And many of the citizens have led useful lives as nurses, homemakers. And we feel maybe that Spencer and his group planted the seeds of industry. No history of Hickory Grove would be complete without mentioning the good relationship that existed between the whites and the blacks. Many financial burdens were lifted and hearts were made glad by Mr. Nathan Harsh. Do you remember Mr. Harsh, Mr. Bates? Yes. He ran a large farm, employed large number of people. And sometimes they called him the black man's spoiler. He was very liberal. I recall, I dare not call names, but I knew a man that bought a lightning rod. He was easily persuaded. Don't write this. He was easily persuaded you could sell him anything, so he bought some lightning rods and had them put on his house. And when the time came to pay for them, he became frightened. He just didn't have the money. He was quite disturbed. So much so he said he was going to go to the river, just jump in the river. And Mr. Harsh heard about this. He came out and paid the indebtedness. And he told his wife, says, if another agent comes here, you let him go to the barn, shuck corn, don't let him talk to anybody. But Mr. Nathan was very liberal, and he employed many of the blacks there. I suppose at one time or more he had over 1,000 head of hogs. And when if you or somebody was sued, or if you'd done some crime or something, he would intercede for you. And then he would tell you to come on down on Monday, and Kenneth would put you to work. Now, I mentioned Uncle Henry Urey and Joe Bell. Their farms joined, and Henry fought with the Southern, and Joe fought with the Federalists. They were friends, yet sometime, and Joe ran a blacksmith shop. Henry would go to the shop, and sometimes they'd begin thinking about the past, and their tempers would flare, and Henry would get angry and go home. And I think Joe was drawing a larger pension or more than Henry. They would go home, Henry would leave, would become angry, and after a few days he would come back, and everything would be all right. Now, years ago, most of the Hickory Grove settlers, they were on the Canoe Branch Road. That's just about 3/4 of a mile from Castalian Springs on the right. I think maybe there are some camps out that way now, but in recent years, most of the families have built homes near the church. About 1907, Dr. Humphrey Bates, the one that played with Grand Ole Opry, His mother was old, and he was selling land, and they said he sold more land. She would sign the deed, and he was measuring the land. And he sold land on the Hartsville Pike, made it possible for some 8 or 10 families to build homes there near the church. I didn't mention molasses making time. That was an event in the community when they made molasses. I know you know what molasses cane is. It looks very much like corn. It was carried to a hill or near a spring. It was quite an event in the fall of the year to make molasses, and they would usually start in the afternoon. Often they would hang lanterns for light, and a horse was used for the motor. The horse just went round and round. That did the grinding of this sorghum. And this juice looked very much like rainwater, and it was placed into pans, about as wide as this is and maybe 4 feet long. And it was something like if you'd fix a barbecue pit. And there they had paddles, and they would make this sorghum. You would cook it so long in one pan. There was a vat that you could open, and it would run into another pan. And they would cook that so long. Usually there were 3 pans in cooking this molasses. And then it was, the children enjoyed eating this sorghum. That was quite an event, social event, molasses making times. And he would come around every week blowing his horn, and we would run so eagerly to meet Mr. Biggers. And he would buy opossum hides, butter, and chickens. And then there was now opossums played an important part. You see, they would eat the meat of the opossums, and those hides would be cleared. They would be removed from the opossum and nailed on boards, stretched on boards while they were fresh. And later on, they would be sold at the produce house. You could also take those hides when they dried and cut them. You could make strings for what you call brogan. That's a rough type of shoe. The teenage boys with their fathers engaged in hunting at night. They enjoyed that, and it gave them cash, the hides, and then the meat was used for eating. So their hunting had a twofold purpose. Some of their entertainments that I conclude during the year, you often indulged in debates. They would have debates at their church. They would have cake walks. You would walk for the cakes. They indulged in box suppers. I remember once my father said there was one man and his wife had deserted him, and they had him as a judge. And they had the subject, which would you go, Father, for a woman or money? And they said, if you'd put your hand in the fire and get some money, would you do that? Or if you'd put your hand in the fire and find a woman? Well, naturally, this man whose wife had deserted him voted for money. But they used to spend a great deal of time with their debates. And then they indulged in making molasses candy. That was a pastime. I planned to have made some candy, but when I found out how expensive molasses were, I changed my mind. But they would have this candy making, and molasses. Have you ever made molasses candy? It's delicious. You have to be very careful; it won't burn. But 2 persons could pull it. You have to grease your hands, and that was one of their pastimes, making molasses candy. And the boys engaged in horseshoe playing, and quilting was an affair for the ladies. They would meet and do quite a bit of quilting. The factories now have enticed most of the people from Hickory Grove. It doesn't look like the same place. There are a few who have their homes, and many have sold their homes because a small farmer can't survive now, and most of them have moved away. Yet there are few of them who remain there to carry on, but most of them have. On the pike there's some 8 or 10, but the original Hickory Grove, as we knew it on Canoe Branch Road, they're very few. Most of them have sold their homes to white families. These are those who were, there was a William Henry Harrison. He graduated from Roger Williams in 1897. and he became Assistant Attorney General in Illinois. Peter Vertrees was graduated in 1888. Dora Vertrees, that was his wife, in 1897. Charles Bate in 1900 received his B.S. degree, and Henry Tolliver was graduated and received his B.S. degree in 1905. Nora Bate was graduated from the normal course, and then Alice Bullock Drake was graduated from the normal course in 1901. Some of you perhaps read in the banner about Reed. He writes some religious articles. I don't know that I had an article he wrote here. Well, his father was a student. I think he had something this past week, Be Still to Hear God Speaks. He's a reporter, but his father was a graduate of Roger, then went to Meharry, and was very efficient. All through, I am to point out the students that attended Roger. It seemed they was just put his mark. John Malone had aunties, and there were people at Mount Olive, the Brinkleys. I can just spot them throughout the county, the people that attended Roger and were under Mr. Phoenix. Thank you again.